The gunshots echoed across the Montana plains, leaving Josephine Owens clutching her infant son to her chest as she cowered behind the charred remains of what had once been her home. Tears streamed down her ash-stained face as she watched the last of the raiders disappear over the horizon, taking with them everything she had left in this world except for the precious bundle in her arms. It was 1876, 3 years after Josephine and her husband Thomas had staked their claim outside Rawhide, Montana. They'd built their lives from nothing, surviving harsh winters and unforgiving summers, slowly transforming a plot of wild land into a modest homestead. Thomas had been a good man, hardworking, gentle, with dreams as vast as the Montana sky. But those dreams had died with him 2 weeks ago when a coughing fit had turned to blood, and consumption had finally claimed him after months of suffering. Now, as her 6-month-old son William wailed against her shoulder, Josephine realized she had truly lost everything. The raiders had taken the last of their livestock, their meager savings, and torched the cabin Thomas had built with his own hands. All that remained were the clothes on her back, her wedding ring, and her crying child. "Hush now, William," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We will survive this, we must." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered how. Winter was approaching, and without shelter or provisions, their chances were slim. Rawhide was 15 miles away, a near impossible journey on foot with an infant in her arms. As the sun began to set, painting the destruction around her in shades of amber and gold, Josephine gathered what little she could salvage: a singed blanket to wrap around William, a blackened cooking pot, and Thomas's hunting knife. She would wait until morning to begin the journey to town. The night was long and cold. Huddled against the remains of the stone chimney, the only part of her home still standing, Josephine kept William close to her heart, humming the lullabies her mother had once sung to her. Grief and fear threatened to overwhelm her, but each time William's tiny fingers grasped at her own, she found the strength to push away the darkness for 1 more hour, 1 more minute. Dawn broke clear and crisp. Josephine rose on aching legs, wrapped William securely against her chest with the blanket, and began walking toward Rawhide. The prairie stretched endlessly before her, beautiful and unforgiving. By midday, her lips were cracked from thirst, her arms numb from holding William, and her feet raw inside her worn boots. When William began crying a desperate, hungry wail that tore at her heart, Josephine realized with horror that her milk was drying up. Without proper nourishment herself, her body was failing them both. "Please, God," she prayed, sinking to her knees in the tall grass. "I cannot lose him too." She didn't hear the horse approaching until it was nearly upon her. Startled, Josephine clutched William tighter and turned to face whoever had found them, preparing to defend her child with the last of her strength if necessary. A tall man astride a chestnut stallion regarded her from beneath the brim of a weather-worn hat. His eyes, blue as a summer sky, took in her desperate state with a single sweep. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and steady, "you need help." It wasn't a question, but Josephine nodded anyway, too exhausted to speak. William continued to cry, his little face red with effort, tiny fists balled in frustration. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing broad shoulders and the confident stance of a man accustomed to hard work and harder decisions. He approached slowly, hands visible at his sides. "Name's Hank Vance," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I've got water in my saddlebag and a camp set up about a mile east." Josephine swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "Raiders," she managed finally. "They took everything. My husband's been gone 2 weeks. Consumption." Hank nodded, his expression softening as William's cries grew more insistent. "And this little one?" he asked, gesturing toward the bundle in her arms. "My son, William," Josephine answered, her voice breaking. "He's hungry, but I haven't eaten properly in days." William let out another desperate wail, and Josephine felt tears spring to her eyes. "I have nothing left," she whispered. "Nothing but my baby's cry." Hank Vance studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then, to Josephine's surprise, a gentle smile curved his lips. "That's all I need to hear," he said softly. "Madam, if you'll trust me, I'll see you both safe." Something in his steady gaze, a mixture of compassion and determination, made Josephine nod. She had no choice but to trust this stranger. William's life depended on it. Hank returned to his horse and brought back a canteen. "Small sips," he advised as he handed it to her. "Then we'll get you both to my camp." The water tasted sweeter than anything Josephine could remember. After she had drunk and moistened William's lips, Hank helped her to her feet with strong, gentle hands. "Can you ride?" he asked, nodding toward his horse. "It's been some time," Josephine admitted. "Then I'll walk alongside," Hank decided, lifting her onto the saddle with surprising ease. "Hold on to the reins with one hand and keep the little one secure with the other." As they made their way across the prairie, Josephine learned that Hank Vance was a cattle driver who had broken from his outfit to scout a new route. He spoke little of himself, instead asking about her homestead and how long she had been in Montana territory. 3 years, she told him. "Thomas and I came from Missouri after the war. We wanted to make a fresh start." "Montana's a hard place for fresh starts," Hank commented, "but worth it for those who can weather the storms." His camp was simple but well organized. A small tent, a fire ring with embers still glowing, and provisions carefully stored away from wildlife. After helping Josephine dismount, Hank quickly revived the fire and set a pot of coffee to boil. "I've got dried beef and beans," he said. "Not much, but it'll put strength back in you." As Josephine ate the simple meal, feeling life return to her limbs, William continued to fuss. Hank watched thoughtfully, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin. "My sister's boy was born last spring when I visited Kansas," he explained, opening the tin to reveal a paste-like substance. "She showed me how to make this emergency feeding mix. Flour, sugar, and a bit of dried milk. Mix it with water, and it might help tide him over until we reach town." Josephine stared at him in disbelief. "You know how to feed an infant?" A shadow passed over Hank's face. "I've had cause to learn many things I'd rather not have needed to know." He didn't elaborate further, but his hands were gentle as he showed her how to mix the paste to the right consistency and feed it to William from a clean cloth. Miraculously, William accepted the makeshift meal, his desperate cries subsiding to occasional whimpers as he sucked on the cloth. When he finally fell asleep, Josephine felt tears of relief slide down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at the cowboy. "I don't know how to repay you." Hank shook his head. "No debt between us, Mrs." He paused, realizing he hadn't asked her name. "Owens," she supplied. "Josephine Owens." "Mrs. Owens," he continued, "we'll rest here tonight and head for Rawhide at first light. You have people there?" Josephine shook her head. "We kept to ourselves mostly. Thomas wasn't one for town life." Hank nodded, seeming unsurprised. "Well, there's a widow there, Mrs. Patterson, who takes in those in need. She'll help get you on your feet." "And you?" Josephine found herself asking, surprising herself with her interest in this stranger's plans. "I've got cattle to drive," Hank replied, but something in his expression suggested uncertainty. "But I'll see you settled first." That night, Josephine slept in Hank's tent while he stayed by the fire. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. Each time William stirred, she woke instantly, the terror of their situation rushing back. During one such moment, she heard Hank singing softly to himself a slow, mournful tune about a cowboy far from home. Something about his voice, deep and honest, comforted her, and she drifted back to sleep with the melody following her into her dreams. Morning brought a gentle rain that delayed their departure. Hank seemed unbothered, using the time to repair a tear in Josephine's boot with a needle and waxed thread from his kit. "You're very self-sufficient," Josephine observed as she fed William another mixture of the emergency food. "Out here you have to be," Hank replied without looking up from his task. "A man who can't mend his own gear might not make it through winter." "Is that why you're alone?" she asked, then immediately regretted her boldness. "I'm sorry, that was forward of me." Hank set down the boot, finished with his repairs. "No apology needed, Mrs. Owens, and to answer your question, being alone is a choice sometimes, and sometimes it's just the hand life deals you." He glanced at William. "How's the little one doing today?" "Better," Josephine said, grateful for the change in subject. "The food helped, though he'll need proper milk soon." "Mrs. Patterson keeps goats," Hank informed her. "William will have fresh milk by nightfall." The rain cleared by mid-morning, and they set out for Rawhide with Josephine once again on horseback, while Hank walked alongside. The journey was slow but steady, and as they traveled, Josephine found herself watching Hank when he wasn't looking her way. There was a quiet competence to him that reminded her of Thomas, yet something entirely different as well, a watchfulness, a readiness for danger that spoke of hard lessons learned. "Were you a soldier?" she asked as they stopped to rest at a creek. Hank was silent for so long that Josephine thought he might not answer. "Yes," he finally said, "Confederate cavalry, not something I speak of often." "Thomas was Union," Josephine said softly. "He said the war should stay in the past where it belongs." "Your husband sounds like a wise man," Hank replied, his expression softening. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Owens, truly." "Thank you," she whispered, surprised by how much his simple words meant to her. They reached Rawhide by late afternoon. The town was larger than Josephine remembered from her infrequent visits, a single dusty street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above the rest. People stopped to stare as Hank led his horse through town with Josephine and William astride. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a stern-faced woman with kind eyes who took one look at Josephine's condition and ushered her inside without hesitation. Her small house behind the general store was crowded but clean, with the promised goats bleeding in a pen out back. "Raiders, was it, Mrs. Patterson asked as she helped Josephine settle William in a makeshift crib. "Been more of them lately, picking off isolated homesteads. Sheriff can't keep up. They took everything," Josephine confirmed, the reality of her situation hitting her anew. "I don't know what I'll do now, Mrs. Patterson's weathered hand patted her shoulder. "One day at a time, child. First, we feed you both and get some rest in you. Tomorrow's for planning." Outside, Josephine could hear Hank speaking with Mrs. Patterson's husband, arranging to stable his horse. When he came in to say goodbye, Josephine felt an unexpected pang of loss. "You're leaving?" she asked, unable to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Got to check in with my outfit," Hank explained. "They'll be wondering where I've gotten to." He glanced around the small room, seeming satisfied with her accommodations. "You're in good hands here." "I don't know how to thank you," Josephine said, rising from her chair. William was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, his belly full of goat's milk. "No thanks needed," Hank insisted. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Josephine said with certainty. "Not anyone." Something passed between them, then a recognition, perhaps, of the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. Hank cleared his throat and adjusted his hat. "I'll check in before I leave town," he promised. "Make sure you and William are settling in." After he left, Mrs. Patterson gave Josephine a knowing look. "That's a good man," she commented. "Not many like Hank Vance left in these parts." "You know him?" Josephine asked, surprised. "Everybody knows Hank," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Comes through with cattle drives couple times a year, keeps to himself mostly, but always fair in his dealings and generous when he can be." She paused, considering her next words. "Lost his wife and baby daughter to fever about 5 years back, from what I hear. Been drifting since." The information settled in Josephine's chest like a stone. Suddenly, his knowledge of infant care and the shadows in his eyes made sense. Before she could ask more, Mrs. Patterson shooed her toward a small bedroom. "Sleep while the baby sleeps," she advised. "Questions can wait for morning." Despite her exhaustion, Josephine lay awake thinking about Hank Vance, a man who had lost as much as she had, yet still stopped to help a stranger. When sleep finally claimed her, her dreams were filled with open skies and a deep voice singing sad songs. True to his word, Hank returned the next morning. Josephine was helping Mrs. Patterson hang laundry when she spotted him approaching, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. Her heart quickened unexpectedly. "Mrs. Owens," he greeted her, removing his hat. "How are you and William faring today?" "Much better, thanks to you," she replied, suddenly aware of her appearance, hair hastily pinned up, wearing a borrowed dress that was too large for her frame. "I'm glad to hear it." Hank shifted his weight, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "I've spoken with my outfit. We've got 3 weeks before the next drive." Mrs. Patterson, who had been pretending not to listen, suddenly found urgent business inside the house, leaving them alone. 3 weeks," Josephine repeated, unsure what he was telling her. I thought, Hank cleared his throat. That is, if you'd allow it, I'd like to help you rebuild. Not the whole house, there's not time for that, but enough to get you through winter. A shelter, at least. Josephine stared at him, speechless. The offer was generous beyond measure, a stranger willing to dedicate weeks of labor to help her start again. Mr. Vance, she began carefully, I couldn't ask that of you. You didn't ask, he pointed out. I'm offering. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Hank's gaze held her steadily. Because I know what it is to lose everything, Mrs. Owens, and I know how hard it is to build again alone. The simple truth of his words struck her deeply. Mrs. Patterson told me about your wife and daughter, she said softly. I'm so sorry. A flash of pain crossed his features. That was a long time ago. Not so long that it doesn't still hurt, Josephine observed gently. Hank was silent for a moment. No, he finally agreed, not so long. From inside the house, William's cry rose in a familiar pattern that Josephine now recognized as hunger. I should feed him, she said, of course. Hank replaced his hat. Think on my offer. I'll come by tomorrow for your answer. As she watched him walk away, Josephine already knew what her answer would be. The prospect of returning to the homestead terrified her, but the alternative, staying in Rawhide with no means of supporting herself and William, was equally daunting. At least on her land, she had a chance at independence. That evening, after William was asleep, she sat with Mrs. Patterson by the fire and confided her thoughts. It's a sensible plan, the older woman agreed. Your land is yours by right, and Hank's a capable builder. But Josephine, she leaned forward, her expression serious. Be careful with your heart. You're vulnerable now, and Hank's kindness might seem like more than it is. I have no romantic notions, Mrs. Patterson, Josephine assured her, ignoring the warmth that rose to her cheeks. This is purely practical. Mrs. Patterson's knowing smile suggested she didn't entirely believe her. All the same, remember that grief makes strange companions of us all. Give yourself time to heal before you decide what or who comes next in your life. When Hank returned the next day, Josephine was ready with her answer. I accept your offer, Mr. Vance, but with conditions, she told him as they walked along Rawhide's main street. I insist on working alongside you, learning what you're doing so I can maintain it myself. And I'll repay you somehow, perhaps with a share of next year's harvest, if there is one. Hank nodded, seeming to approve of her terms. Agreed, and I have one condition of my own. What's that? Call me Hank. Mr. Vance makes me feel like I'm in trouble with the schoolmaster. Josephine smiled, her first genuine smile in weeks. Only if you'll call me Josephine. Josephine, he repeated, as if testing the name. It suits you. They left for the homestead 2 days later, with supplies purchased on credit from Mr. Patterson's store and a wagon borrowed from a neighbor. The journey was easier than Josephine's desperate flight had been, but as they approached the burned-out remains of her home, grief threatened to overwhelm her again. We buried Thomas under the old oak, she said quietly, nodding toward a solitary tree on a small rise. He loved the view from there. Hank followed her gaze. It's a good spot, peaceful. They made camp that first night away from the ruins in a clearing near the creek that ran through the property. As Josephine settled William for sleep, Hank built a fire and began sketching plans in the dirt with a stick. The chimney's still standing, he observed. That gives us a solid starting point. We can build a one-room shelter against it, enough to keep you warm and dry through winter. Come spring, you can decide whether to expand or start fresh elsewhere. Josephine joined him by the fire, looking at his rough drawings. It seems so small compared to what we had. Small is easier to heat, Hank pointed out practically, and it's just the two of you. The reminder of Thomas's absence stung, but Josephine nodded. You're right, of course. They worked from sunrise to sunset each day, clearing debris first, then salvaging what could be reused. Hank taught Josephine how to split logs and notch them for joining, how to mix mud and straw for chinking, how to judge if a beam was sound enough to bear weight. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her muscles ached, then strengthened. Through it all, William was a constant presence, napping in a makeshift cradle Hank constructed from a wooden crate, watching them work with increasingly alert eyes, learning to roll over on a blanket spread in the shade. He seemed to flourish in the open air, and his cries became less frequent as regular meals of goat's milk, brought fresh every few days by Mr. Patterson, filled his growing body. On the seventh day, as they paused for a midday meal, Hank surprised Josephine by asking about her life before Montana. "I grew up in St. Louis," she told him, wiping sweat from her brow. "My father owned a bookshop. He taught me to read before I could properly walk, or so my mother claimed." "That explains your speech," Hank noted. "I wondered about your education." Josephine smiled, remembering her father's crowded shop with its smell of paper and leather. "I had schooling until I was 16, then my father died and the shop had to be sold to pay his debts. My mother and I took in sewing to survive." She glanced at William, who was contentedly gumming a wooden spoon. "When I met Thomas, he spoke so beautifully about the West, open land, fresh air, the chance to build something of our own. After we married and Mother passed, there seemed no reason to stay." "Do you regret it?" Hank asked. "Coming here?" Josephine considered the question seriously. "No," she finally said. "Despite everything, no, Thomas was happy here. He died hard, but he lived well. I can't regret giving him that." Hank nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And what about you, Josephine? Did you live well here too?" The question caught her off guard. Few people had ever asked about her happiness separate from her husband's. "Parts were harder than I expected," she admitted. "The isolation especially. But there were moments of such beauty: sunrise over the plains, wildflowers after rain, stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch." She looked around at the land that was hers. "I'd like William to know those things too." "He will," Hank assured her. Then, with a slight smile, "And perhaps you'll make more trips to town now and then. Good for both of you to see other faces." "Perhaps we will," Josephine agreed, touched by his concern. As the days passed and the shelter took shape, Josephine found herself watching Hank with increasing curiosity. He was a man of contradictions, capable of felling trees and lifting heavy beams, yet gentle enough to rock William when Josephine needed both hands for a task. He spoke little of himself, but she gathered pieces. He had grown up on a small ranch in Texas, ridden with Confederate Rangers during the war, drifted northward after losing his family, and found work with cattle outfits that valued his skills and asked few questions. "Do you ever think of settling again?" she asked him one evening as they sat by the fire, the shelter's roof finally complete above them. Hank was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I used to think not," he finally said. "After Sarah and the baby died, I couldn't imagine wanting roots again." He glanced up, meeting her eyes across the fire. "Lately, I've been reconsidering." Something in his gaze made Josephine's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, William began to fuss and the moment passed. The next day, as they worked side by side fitting the door frame, Hank suddenly stopped, his hand going to the knife at his belt. "What is it?" Josephine asked, alarmed by his sudden alertness. "Riders," he said tersely. "Get William and go inside." Josephine didn't argue. Scooping William from his cradle, she retreated into the partially completed shelter, watching through a gap in the wall as 3 men on horseback approached from the direction of town. Hank stood his ground, one hand still near his knife, the other casually resting on the axe he'd been using. As the riders drew closer, Josephine recognized the man in front, Sam Blackburn, a rancher whose property bordered hers to the north. Thomas had never trusted him, suspecting Blackburn of moving boundary markers to claim more land for himself. "Vance," Blackburn called as they reined to a stop. "Heard you were out here playing house builder." His gaze shifted to the shelter. "Mrs. Owens in there?" "She is," Hank replied evenly. "Something I can help you with, Blackburn?" "Just being neighborly," Blackburn answered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Wanted to check on the widow, make sure she's managing." He leaned forward in his saddle. "In fact, I came to make her an offer on this land. Generous offer, considering the circumstances." Josephine stepped out of the shelter, William in her arms. "Mr. Blackburn," she greeted him coolly. "Any offer for my land would be premature. As you can see, I'm rebuilding." Blackburn's smile faltered slightly. "Mrs. Owens, be reasonable. A woman alone can't work this land properly, especially with a baby to care for. I'm offering fair price and the chance to start fresh in town." "I appreciate your concern." Josephine replied, her voice steady despite the anger flaring inside her. "But this is my home, and I intend to keep it." One of Blackburn's companions, a wiry man with a pockmarked face, spat tobacco juice on the ground. "Might want to reconsider, madam." "Terrible thing, what happened to your place? Raiders are still around these parts, no telling when they might come back." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air. Hank shifted his stance slightly, placing himself between Josephine and the riders. "That sounded an awful lot like a threat, mister," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Just stating facts," the man replied with a shrug. "Dangerous country for a lone woman." "She's not alone," Hank stated firmly. Blackburn's eyes narrowed as he looked between Hank and Josephine. "I hear you're just passing through Vance. Cattle drive moving on soon. Plans change," Hank replied simply. A tense silence followed. Finally, Blackburn straightened in his saddle. "Well, my offer stands, Mrs. Owens. When you come to your senses, you know where to find me." He tipped his hat with mock politeness and turned his horse. "Vance," he added, "watch yourself. Drifters aren't always welcome around these parts." After the riders disappeared from view, Josephine released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said to Hank. "That was trouble," Hank finished for her, his expression grim. "Blackburn's got his eye on your water rights. That creek's valuable." "Do you think he was behind the raid?" Josephine asked, the possibility only now occurring to her. Hank considered this. "Can't say for certain, but the timing's convenient. Wait until you're most vulnerable, then swoop in with an offer." He ran a hand through his hair, looking troubled. "We should finish this shelter as quickly as possible. And I think I'll send word to some friends about delaying my return to the outfit." "You'd stay longer." Josephine couldn't keep the hope from her voice. "Just until we're sure Blackburn gets the message," Hank clarified, though something in his eyes suggested there might be more to his decision. They worked with renewed urgency after that, completing the door and shutters for the 2 small windows by nightfall. The next day they built a sleeping platform raised off the ground, with space beneath for storage. By the 10th day, the shelter was weathertight, with a small porch facing away from the prevailing wind. "It's not much," Hank apologized as they stood back to admire their work, "but it will keep you warm and dry." "It's perfect," Josephine assured him, emotion thick in her throat. "I never thought I'd have a home again." That night, they moved their sleeping arrangements inside for the first time. The single room felt intimate in a way their outdoor camp had not, and Josephine was acutely aware of Hank's presence as he spread his bedroll near the door, positioning himself between her and any potential danger. "Hank," she said softly after they had extinguished the lamp. William was already asleep in his cradle beside her platform. "What happens when you leave?" The darkness hid his expression, but she heard him shift. "What do you mean, Blackburn?" she clarified, though part of her was asking a different question entirely. "Will he cause trouble once you're gone?" "He might try," Hank admitted. "But I've been thinking on that. Sheriff Preston owes me a favor from way back. I'll speak to him before I go, make sure he keeps an eye on things here." "And if that's not enough," Josephine pressed. Hank was silent for a long moment. "Then I'll come back," he finally said, his voice low but certain. "If you need me, Josephine, I'll come back." The simple promise eased something in her chest that had been tight with worry. "Thank you," she whispered. Neither spoke again, but Josephine lay awake long after Hank's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep. Something was changing between them, something unexpected and fragile and frightening in its potential. Thomas had been gone only a month, and guilt nagged at her for even considering what her heart was beginning to suggest. Yet as she finally drifted towards sleep, Josephine couldn't deny the comfort she found in Hank's presence, or the dread she felt at the thought of his eventual departure. The following days brought a shift in their work. With the shelter complete, they turned to preparing for winter, splitting firewood, smoking the meat from a deer Hank had shot, digging a root cellar, and salvaging what they could from Josephine's ruined garden. Each task brought them into closer cooperation, their movements becoming naturally synchronized as they learned each other's rhythms. On the 14th day, as they worked side by side plaiting dried grasses into insulation for the root cellar, Hank suddenly asked, "What was he like, Thomas?" Josephine's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. Kind, she said after a moment. Patient. He loved this land in a way I never fully understood, something almost spiritual about it for him. He wasn't a man for many words, but when he did speak, people listened. Hank nodded, his expression thoughtful. Sounds like a good man. He was, Josephine agreed. Then, gathering her courage, what about your wife? What was she like? Pain flashed in Hank's eyes, but he didn't deflect the question. Sarah was fire to my earth, he said softly. Quick to laugh, quick to anger, passionate about everything. She'd set her mind to something and there was no swaying her. A faint smile touched his lips at the memory. She wanted a ranch of our own in the worst way, was saving every penny I earned driving cattle. And your daughter? Josephine asked gently. Eleanor, Hank said, the name clearly precious to him. She was just 4 months old when the fever took them both. Had Sarah's eyes, though, big and brown and full of mischief already. Impulsively, Josephine reached out and touched his hand. I'm so sorry, Hank. He turned his palm up, closing his fingers around hers briefly before letting go. Life goes on, he said simply. Has to. That evening, Mr. Patterson arrived with supplies and news from town. While he and Hank unloaded the wagon, he informed them that a new family had arrived in Rawhide, taking over the old Miller place. Name's Johnson, Mr. Patterson explained. Wife and 3 little ones. Man's a blacksmith by trade. Good news for the town. And Blackburn? Hank asked. Any word on his movements? Mr. Patterson's expression grew serious. Been gathering men at his ranch. Claims he's planning a big roundup, but it's the wrong season for it. Sheriff's keeping an eye on things. After Mr. Patterson departed, promising to return in a week, Hank was unusually quiet. Josephine watched him as he meticulously cleaned his rifle, a task he hadn't felt necessary until now. You're worried, she observed, sitting beside him on the porch steps. Hank didn't deny it. Blackburn's planning something. I'd bet my last dollar on it. What can we do? Be ready, Hank replied simply. And I think I'll write to some friends tonight, men I trust, ask them to pay a visit. Cowboy friends? Josephine asked. A slight smile crossed Hank's face. Not exactly. Men I rode with during the war. They settled about 50 miles west of here. Ex-Confederate soldiers, Josephine stated, understanding. Among other things, Hank confirmed. But they're good men despite what side they fought on, and they know how to handle trouble. That night, after William's feeding, Josephine found herself unable to sleep. Rising quietly, she stepped outside to find Hank sitting on the porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. Couldn't sleep, he asked without turning. Too much on my mind, she admitted, sitting beside him. The night was cool but not cold, the air fragrant with sage and pine. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, shoulders almost touching. Finally, Hank spoke, his voice low. I'm due back with my outfit in 4 days. Though she had known this moment was coming, the words still struck Josephine like a physical blow. So soon, she murmured. I've sent word about Blackburn, Hank continued. My friends should arrive tomorrow or the next day. They'll stay until we're sure the danger's past. And then you'll go, Josephine said, unable to keep the sadness from her voice. Hank turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. Unless you ask me to stay. The simple statement hung between them, weighted with everything unspoken. Josephine's heart raced as she met his gaze. Would you? She whispered, if I asked. Yes, Hank answered without hesitation. But Josephine, I need to know it's what you truly want. You've been through so much, lost so much. I won't take advantage of that vulnerability. His consideration only made her feelings stronger. When Thomas died, she said slowly, I thought my heart died with him. Then the raiders came, and all I had left was William and my own determination to keep him safe. She took a deep breath. But since you found us on the prairie, something's changed. I've changed. Grief does that, Hank said gently, makes us see things differently. This isn't just grief, Josephine insisted. What I feel when I'm with you, it's not about what I've lost, Hank, it's about what I've found. In the moonlight, she saw his expression soften. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, Hank raised his hand to her cheek. I never expected to find you, he said quietly. Never thought I'd want to build something again with anyone. His thumb brushed lightly across her skin. But here you are, and here I am, and damned if I can make myself leave. Josephine leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. Then don't, she whispered. When his lips met hers, the kiss was gentle, questioning then deepening as she responded. His arms encircled her, strong and secure, and Josephine felt something broken inside her begin to heal. They broke apart at the sound of William's cry from inside the shelter. Josephine rested her forehead against Hank's, a small laugh escaping her. "He has perfect timing," she murmured. Hank smiled, pressing another quick kiss to her lips before releasing her. "Go to him. We have time to figure the rest out." As Josephine tended to William, her mind raced with possibilities she hadn't dared consider before. A future with Hank by her side, building something permanent together, giving William a father who would love and protect him. But first, they had to deal with Blackburn. Hank's friends arrived the next day, three weathered men with hard eyes and easy smiles who introduced themselves as Jim Collins, Frank Miller, and Daniel Reeves. They greeted Hank with the familiar affection of men who had faced danger together and treated Josephine with a courteous respect that put her immediately at ease. "Hank says you've got trouble," Jim Collins said without preamble after they had settled in. "Man named Blackburn wanting your land." "That's the sum of it," Josephine confirmed, offering the men coffee. "Blackburn's got about 15 men working for him," Hank added. "Most are just ranch hands, but a few have the look of hired guns about them." Daniel Reeves, the oldest of the three, nodded thoughtfully. "Numbers aren't in our favor, but surprise might be. How soon do you figure he'll make a move?" "Soon," Hank said grimly. "He knows I'm supposed to leave with a cattle drive. My guess is he's waiting for that." "Then we disappoint him," Frank Miller suggested, a grin spreading across his scarred face. "Let him think you've gone, see what he does." They spent the afternoon strategizing, with Josephine contributing her knowledge of the surrounding land. By evening, they had a plan. Hank would ride openly to Rawhide the next day, making a show of saying his goodbyes. Meanwhile, the others would establish positions around the property, ready for whatever Blackburn might attempt. "I don't like leaving you as bait," Hank told Josephine privately as they washed dishes together after supper. "I'll have William with me at all times," she assured him, "and your friends seem very capable." "They are," Hank agreed. "Been through hell together, the four of us." He paused, his hands stilling in the water. "Josephine, if anything happens to me, don't," she interrupted firmly. "Nothing's going to happen to you, to any of us." Hank searched her face, then nodded. "All right, but know this: what I said last night, I meant it. If we get through this, I want to stay. Build something real here with you and William." Josephine's throat tightened with emotion. "I want that too," she whispered. The next morning, Hank departed for Rawhide with a public farewell that included specific mentions of when his cattle outfit would be leaving the territory, information certain to reach Blackburn's ears. Jim, Frank, and Daniel established their positions, Jim in the root cellar with a clear view of the approach from the north, Frank concealed in a stand of trees to the east, and Daniel in the remains of the barn with a rifle trained on the main trail. Josephine went about her day as normally as possible, hanging laundry, tending to William, and keeping a pot of stew simmering on the stove. If Blackburn was watching, she wanted to appear vulnerable and unaware. Dusk was falling when Hank returned, approaching from an unexpected direction that kept him hidden from any watching eyes. He slipped into the shelter through the back window, where Josephine waited with William. "Blackburn was in town," he reported in a low voice. "Watching me. I made a show of saying goodbye to the Pattersons, then circled back through the creek bed." "So he thinks you're gone," Josephine confirmed. "He does. And I heard his men talking at the saloon. They're planning to come tonight." Josephine's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "What do we do?" "Stay inside with William," Hank instructed, checking his pistol. "Keep the lamp low. If shooting starts, get under the sleeping platform with the baby." As night fell completely, the homestead grew eerily quiet. Josephine sat with William in her arms, listening for any sound that might signal Blackburn's approach. Hank positioned himself by the window, a shadow among shadows. The attack, when it came, was swift but not silent. The pounding of hooves announced riders approaching fast from the north. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness as Blackburn and 6 men thundered into the clearing before the shelter. "Mrs. Owens," Blackburn's voice rang out. "Come on out now. We need to talk about your situation." Josephine remained silent, clutching William closer as he stirred at the noise. "We know you're alone," Blackburn continued. "Your cowboy friend left town. This can go easy or hard, your choice." The first shot came from Daniel's position, striking the ground near Blackburn's horse and causing it to rear in panic. Instantly, the night erupted in gunfire as Jim and Frank opened fire from their positions, creating the impression of a much larger defending force. Hank squeezed Josephine's shoulder once, then slipped out the back window to join the fight. Through a crack in the shutters, she watched as confusion spread among Blackburn's men, who had clearly expected to find a solitary woman, not coordinated resistance. "It's a trap," one of them shouted, wheeling his horse around only to be thrown as Jim's shot caught the animal in the flank. Blackburn himself remained mounted, firing blindly toward the barn where Daniel continued to pin down two of his men with well-placed shots. "Burn her out," Blackburn ordered, gesturing toward the shelter. Before his men could comply, Hank's voice rang out from behind them. "Drop your guns or die where you stand, Blackburn." Josephine's breath caught as she saw Hank step into view, rifle aimed steadily at Blackburn's chest. In the chaos, he had managed to circle behind the attackers, cutting off their escape route. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Blackburn slowly raised his pistol not to surrender, but to aim at Hank. Two shots rang out simultaneously. Blackburn swayed in his saddle, a look of surprise crossing his face as blood bloomed on his chest. Hank dropped to one knee, his left arm hanging limp at his side where Blackburn's bullet had found its mark. The remaining attackers, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons. Jim, Frank, and Daniel emerged from their hiding places, quickly securing the survivors. "Hank." Josephine called, unable to stay hidden any longer. With William held tightly against her chest, she rushed to where Hank was now sitting on the ground, his face pale in the moonlight. "Stay back," he warned, though his voice lacked strength. "Make sure they're all disarmed." "Already done," Frank assured him, approaching with a strip of cloth torn from his shirt. "Let me see that arm, you stubborn mule." As Frank worked to bind Hank's wound, Josephine knelt beside them, her free hand finding Hank's. "How bad?" she asked Frank quietly. "Through and through," Frank replied, tying off the makeshift bandage. "He'll keep the arm, but he'll be cursing like a sailor when the shock wears off." "Worth it," Hank muttered, his fingers tightening around Josephine's. "You and William are safe, that's what matters." By morning, the situation had been resolved with surprising efficiency. Jim and Daniel had escorted the surviving attackers to Rawhide, where Sheriff Preston took them into custody after hearing the full story. Frank remained at the homestead, helping Josephine tend to Hank's wound and keeping watch in case any of Blackburn's men who hadn't joined the attack decided to seek revenge. Hank, despite his protests, was confined to Josephine's sleeping platform, his arm properly cleaned and bandaged with supplies Frank had retrieved from his saddlebag. "You're lucky," Josephine told him as she changed the dressing on the second day. "An inch to the right and the bullet might have hit something vital." "I was born lucky," Hank replied with a weak smile. "Found you, didn't I?" The simple statement warmed her heart. "Rest," she instructed, placing a gentle kiss on his forehead. "You need to heal." Over the next week, as Hank's strength returned, news arrived from town. Blackburn had not survived his wound, and his ranch was being sold to settle debts no one had known he carried. His hired men had scattered, and the threat to Josephine's land appeared to be over. Jim and Daniel returned with the news, bringing additional supplies and a letter for Hank from his cattle outfit. Josephine watched anxiously as he read it, wondering if it would call him away despite his injury and his promise to stay. "Well?" she finally asked when he folded the letter and tucked it away. "They've found another scout," Hank informed her. "Wish me well and say my job's waiting if I ever want it back." He looked up at her, his eyes clear and certain. "I told them I wouldn't be coming back." Relief and joy flooded through her. "Are you sure? Driving cattle is what you know." "I know other things," Hank said, reaching for her hand. "How to build, how to grow, how to protect what matters." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "If you'll have me, Josephine, I'd like to make a life here." "With you and William." Jim cleared his throat loudly. "Think that's our cue to check on the horses, boys," he announced, Ushering Daniel and Frank outside with exaggerated haste, alone with Hank, Josephine sat on the edge of the platform, her heart full to bursting. "It won't be easy," she warned. "This land demands everything you have to give." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Hank assured her, "and we'll face it together." He sat up straighter, wincing slightly at the movement. "I know it's soon, Josephine. I know you're still grieving Thomas, and I respect that. But I love you and William both. I think I've loved you since I heard that baby crying on the prairie and saw you ready to defend him with your last breath." Tears sprang to Josephine's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think it was possible to love again so soon, but my heart doesn't seem to care about timing." Hank pulled her gently toward him with his good arm, and she went willingly into his embrace. Their kiss was a promise of healing, of building, of a future neither had dared to imagine before finding the other. When they finally broke apart, Josephine rested her head against Hank's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "What will people think?" she wondered aloud. "A widow remarrying so quickly." "People will talk," Hank acknowledged. "They always do, but anyone who matters will understand that life's too short and too precious to waste on what others think." "Remarrying," Josephine repeated, raising her head to look at him with a teasing smile. "I don't recall a proposal, Mr. Vance." Hank's laugh was warm and genuine. "Well now, Mrs. Owens, I was getting to that part before you interrupted me." His expression grew serious again. "Josephine, will you marry me? Let me be a father to William and a husband to you for as many years as were granted." "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "With all my heart, yes." They were married 3 weeks later in Rawhide's small church, with William cooing contentedly in Mrs. Patterson's arms and Hank's friends standing as witnesses. The town had been surprised by the swift courtship, but seeing them together, the tenderness in Hank's gaze, the new light in Josephine's eyes, few could doubt the genuineness of their feelings. After the simple ceremony, they returned to the homestead, no longer a makeshift shelter, but the beginning of a true home. With help from Jim, Frank, and Daniel, who had decided to settle in the area themselves, Hank had already begun expanding the one-room structure, adding a proper bedroom and laying the foundation for what would eventually become a comfortable family home. That night, as William slept peacefully in his new cradle crafted by Hank during his recovery, Josephine stood with her husband on their porch, looking out at the land that had taken so much from her and yet, somehow, given her a new beginning. "What are you thinking?" Hank asked, his arms encircling her from behind. "That life is strange," she replied honestly. "6 weeks ago I thought everything was lost. Now." She turned in his embrace to face him. "Now I have more than I ever dreamed possible." "We both do," Hank agreed, kissing her softly. As winter settled over the Montana territory, the Vance homestead stood strong against the wind and snow. Inside, a family that fate had brought together against all odds found warmth not just in their hearth, but in the love. They shared a love born from loss, but growing stronger with each passing day. Spring brought new life to the land and to the family. Josephine's garden flourished under her careful tending, and the first of their new livestock, 2 milk cows, a dozen chickens, and a sturdy plow horse transformed the homestead into a working farm. William took his first steps across the packed earth floor, toddling from Josephine's outstretched arms to Hank's waiting hands, his delighted laughter filling their home. By summer, Josephine knew she was carrying their first child together. When she shared the news with Hank, his joy was tempered with a moment of remembrance for Eleanor, the daughter he had lost. But as he placed a gentle hand on Josephine's still flat stomach, hope outshone grief in his eyes. "This child will know about Thomas," he promised her. "And about Sarah and Eleanor. They'll always be part of who we are." Josephine covered his hand with her own. "Yes," she agreed, "our past shapes us, but it doesn't define our future." Their son, James Thomas Vance, was born on a crisp autumn day in 1877 with Mrs. Patterson serving as midwife and Hank pacing anxiously outside until the infant's first cry rang out. When Hank held his son for the first time, the look of wonder on his face brought tears to Josephine's eyes. "He's perfect," Hank whispered, carefully tracing a finger along the baby's cheek. "Just like his father," Josephine replied with a tired smile. William, not quite 2 years old, regarded his new brother with solemn curiosity, reaching out to touch the tiny fingers with surprising gentleness. "Baby," he pronounced carefully, one of the few words in his growing vocabulary. "That's right," Hank affirmed, including the toddler in the moment. "Your baby brother, William. You'll help us take care of him, won't you?" William nodded seriously, and Josephine's heart swelled with love for her expanding family, a family built not just on blood ties, but on choice and commitment and the courage to begin again. As James grew from infant to toddler and William from toddler to little boy, the homestead prospered under Hank and Josephine's joint efforts. The one-room shelter evolved into a proper ranch house, with 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen where Josephine experimented with recipes from her mother's handwritten cookbook, and a covered porch where the family gathered on summer evenings to watch the sunset. Hank's friends remained close, with Jim Collins establishing a successful horse breeding operation on the old Blackburn property, and Frank and Daniel partnering on a freight business that served the growing communities in the region. Their frequent visits kept the Vance household connected to the wider world, bringing news and companionship that Josephine had sorely missed during her isolated years with Thomas. In 1880, their daughter Sarah Eleanor Vance joined the family, her arrival coinciding with a particularly bountiful harvest that allowed Hank to purchase additional acreage adjoining their property. The little girl had her father's blue eyes and her mother's quiet determination, crawling before she was 6 months old and talking in full sentences by her 2nd birthday. Life wasn't always easy. Montana winters remained harsh, threatening livestock and testing the soundness of their home. Drought years brought anxiety about crops and water supplies. But through it all, Hank and Josephine faced challenges together, their partnership strengthening with each obstacle overcome. William, now 7, grew into a thoughtful boy who resembled his birth father in appearance, but had absorbed Hank's steady nature and practical approach to problems. He showed a natural affinity for horses and spent hours helping Hank with the small herd of Mustangs they had begun training for sale to neighboring ranchers. "He has a gift," Hank observed one evening as they watched William patiently working with a skittish colt. "Horse sense isn't something you can teach. He admires you so much," Josephine said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "Sometimes I worry he doesn't remember Thomas at all. We keep Thomas alive in our stories," Hank reminded her gently, "and in the man William is becoming. That's what matters." By 1885, the Vance Ranch had become one of the most respected in the county, known for its well-bred horses and quality beef cattle. Rawhide had grown as well, boasting a proper school that the Vance children attended, riding in together on a sturdy pony with William, now 12 and responsible beyond his years, in charge of his siblings. The arrival of the railroad that year brought further changes to the region, making it easier to ship livestock to eastern markets and bringing new settlers with diverse skills and backgrounds. Josephine, who had once felt isolated on her remote homestead, now found herself at the center of a thriving community, hosting gatherings for neighboring families and taking an active role in establishing the town's first lending library. Through it all, her relationship with Hank remained the cornerstone of her life. They had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, faced down threats from nature and human enemies alike, and built something neither had believed possible after their first devastating losses. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting that fateful day, when Hank had found Josephine and William alone on the prairie, the family held a special celebration. Friends and neighbors gathered at the ranch for a feast prepared by Josephine and the children, now including 4-year-old Robert Frank Vance, their youngest and most adventurous offspring. As twilight settled over the gathering, Hank stood and raised his glass, drawing the attention of their guests. "10 years ago," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I was a drifter with no home and no purpose beyond the next cattle drive. Then I heard a baby crying." His gaze found Josephine across the crowd, and the love in his eyes made her heart skip even after all their years together. "That cry changed everything," Hank continued. It led me to the bravest woman I've ever known and gave me a family I never thought I'd have. He raised his glass higher. To Josephine, who rebuilt from ashes, to our children, who give meaning to every day, and to second chances which come when we least expect them but need them most. As their friends cheered and glasses clinked, Josephine made her way to Hank's side. Taking his hand in hers, she looked up at the man who had transformed from stranger to savior to beloved husband. "When you found us that day," she said softly, for his ears alone, "I had nothing left but William's cry and my own determination to survive." "That was all I needed to hear," Hank replied, echoing the words he had spoken a decade earlier. "It still is." Their kiss, witnessed by friends and family, sealed a journey that had begun in desperation but blossomed into something extraordinary, a testament to love's power to heal, to rebuild, and to create hope from the ashes of loss. And as the stars appeared one by one over the Montana prairie, Josephine Vance knew with absolute certainty that the cry that had once signaled her darkest hour had become the first note in the symphony of her greatest joy.